Hello everyone, it's Tuesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. This is the last week before we usher in the new year. And so Within the Frame aims to wrap up 2023 this week by sharing details of what happened under different topics each day. Today we would like to focus on the three-way cooperation between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo, which has been the core alignment South Korea was able to forge against North Korea's threats. President Yoon Suk Yeol's resolution over the issue of compensating victims of Japan's wartime forced labor opened the door for Seoul-Tokyo bilateral ties to improve. This eventually gave momentum for trilateral cooperation involving the U.S. to see a landmark agreement reached during the Camp David Trilateral Summit in August. What were the details agreed during this year's historic summits, and how significant were they? For this, we have invited Professor Hironori Sasada from Hokkaido University. Professor Sasada, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Bruce Klinger, Senior Research Fellow from the Heritage Foundation. Good to have you with us, Mr. Klinger.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, first question to our Professor Sasada. Bilateral relations between South Korea and Japan warmed up as Seoul proposed a resolution to the long-standing row over the issue of compensating Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. What led Seoul to come up with the resolution, and how was it viewed internationally?
Yes, the resolution certainly reflected the Yoon government's willingness to cooperate with Japan in economic, security, and other issues. But it is also important to keep in mind that Japan-Korea relationship is deeply affected by its ties with the United States. The Korean government's new approach clearly reflects the Biden administration's desire to have trilateral security cooperation in East Asia and in the Pacific. Both Japan and Korea have been strongly encouraged by the United States to settle disputes among them. And they have made significant improvements in many areas. However, the Korean Supreme Court's ruling on the wartime labor issue on December 21st will certainly overshadow the two countries' relationship. So the governments have to keep on working closely to prevent the relationship from soaring. Also, it is crucial for the Korean government to win the public support on its policy towards Japan to prevent the improved relationship from being short-lived.
All right, I see. Though there are still some concerns, Professor Sasada, Seoul's decision indeed brought about a dramatic warming of bilateral relationships. And this led the two countries to resume reciprocal visits. President Yoon held summits with his Japanese counterpart and agreed to lift export control measures and resume GSOMIA. Could you tell us more about this?
Sure. The recent actions taken by the Yoon government were a big surprise for the Japanese side, but it was certainly received positively by the Japanese and also by Western countries in general. Whether it's about the water waste in Fukushima, the wartime labor issue, and other history-related issues. The recent opinion poll showed that about 30% of Japanese people viewed the two countries' relationship positively. The number had tripled from 5 years ago. I understand that President Yoon's actions were accompanied by political risks and costs, and Japanese political leaders understand and deeply appreciate such actions by President Yoon. Particularly, Korea's rational and calm reaction to the Fukushima water release, which was quite contrast to China's reaction. And it was very helpful to Japan. And that is why the Japanese government agreed to resume currency swap, GSOMIA, and lift export restrictions. An important take from this, I think, is that the both sides have learned that cooperation is possible and we can overcome disputes, and we have more to gain from cooperation than disputes.
Right, I see, and I cannot agree more. And it's really good to hear such results of the survey. But Professor Sasada, I'd like to ask if such an improved relationship would be able to continue. Because as far as I know, the Prime Minister Kishida is reportedly losing his grip on the Liberal Democratic Party amid an unfolding political fund scandal. And if there were any changes regarding Kishida's position, how would that affect Seoul-Tokyo ties?
Yes, Kishida is facing serious challenges right now. His cabinet members are facing financial scandals. His policies concerning tax and social welfare are not received well by the public. So his approval rates have dropped below 25%, which is extremely low in the Japanese standard. So there might be a change in political leadership in Japan sometime next year. However, it is unlikely, I think, that the governing LDP would lose power anytime soon. And the party will stay in power for the coming years. And within the LDP leadership, there is no big disagreement with regard to the relationship between Japan and South Korea. Also, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is quite keen on retaining consistency in Japan's diplomatic policy. So I do not expect any sudden change in two countries' ties in the near future.
All right, no sudden changes expected. Well, Professor Sasada, thank you for explaining about the Seoul-Tokyo ties for this year. Now, Mr. Klinger, we cannot leave out Seoul-Washington ties. Marking the 70th anniversary of the alliance between South Korea and the U.S., President Yoon and Biden adopted the Washington Declaration and ensured Washington's extended deterrence against North Korea. Now, what was agreed during the summit and how significant was it in your opinion?
Well, I've been in Washington for, a lot of years, and I don't really remember any summits that the U.S. had that seemed more successful than this. And there were a number of reasons for that. Is the coming within the 70th anniversary year of the alliance, it really had an emotional impact. There was a very strong sense, not only of history and shared turmoil during the Korean War, but all the decades since, as well as a very bright future, in large part because of the election of President Yoon, who's brought policies very much into line with the values and the principles and objectives of the United States and other Indo-Pacific democracies. Also, I think we have to look back on what was preceding his summit. When I was able to get back to Korea after the COVID pandemic, I had been really struck by how the South Korean indigenous nuclear weapon topic had moved from fringe elements to the center. And in December and January when I was there, I really had a sense that it could be a crisis in the alliance. So many of us who had traveled to Seoul met with U.S. officials and urged them to be more transparent, more forward-leaning on sharing nuclear information. And within just a very short period of time, I think the U.S. had done a lot of actions which led to a real reversal in South Korean government thinking and public thinking, which led to the very successful April summit with the Washington Declaration. And so President Yoon sort of affirmed that South Korea would not go on a nuclear weapons path. That took the wind out of the sails of those who had been advocating it. And in return, the U.S. not only affirmed its longstanding commitment, but was willing to agree to a nuclear consultative group to try to add additional measures of assurance to our Korean ally.
Right, it was an indeed very significant summit. And since Mr. Klinger, you mentioned the NCG, the Nuclear Consultative Group. This, in fact, had its second session quite recently and decided to complete establishing guidelines for planning and operating a shared nuclear strategy. But what were the details of this meeting and what tasks remain?
Well, a lot of the details really aren't known because they're classified or sensitive, particularly when you're discussing nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. But when I talked to a South Korean official, he was very positive of the steps that both countries have taken since the beginning of the year. Some of the same officials who are quite negative or skeptical of what the U.S. might do when I met with them in January, and then by April had a very different view, and then they continue to move beyond what an earlier view had been like, well, this is all very good, but we'll have to see how it plays out. And now they feel that it's playing out quite well. So we've had tabletop exercises. We've had South Koreans in sort of an immersion class of nuclear strategy. They've had visits to U.S. nuclear weapons capable facilities and systems. And so it's just really a lot of processes, a lot of procedures, a lot of steps building upon the previous steps. So there's more to come. There's more that needs to be done. But the important thing is that the U.S. has taken a lot of steps beyond what it was willing to do for decades. And the South Koreans feel much more reassured about the U.S. commitment.
Right, indeed, indeed. Now, Mr. Klinger, staying on this NCG, I'd like to ask you one more. Though security officials emphasized that the focus of the NCG for now would be bilateral, they did not rule out the group's expansion to other areas or countries, especially as security cooperation efforts with Japan continue. What are the chances of expansion taking place?
Well, I think it's in all of our interest to have not only trilateral cooperation on any range of security issues, but also others, including Australia. So whether we expand the NCG into a trilateral or whether we create a separate trilateral or quadrilateral group is a bit immaterial. But as we've seen with the expanding of the cooperation between South Korea and Japan, and then also trilaterally, it really just makes sense to maintain that process and that momentum. So when we've had finally the implementation of a promise from a year ago by the three leaders to have real-time exchange of warning information about North Korean missiles, it makes sense then to expand on that to other strategy, because Japan will be involved in any kind of contingency operations on the Korean Peninsula, as well as the UN sending states. So really, I think the more transparency, the more coordination, the more collaboration is really in all of our interests.
All right, I see your point, Mr. Klinger. Now, one last question on Seoul-Washington ties. In 2024, some major elections will take place, including South Korea's general elections, voting for lawmakers, and the U.S. presidential election as well. Mr. Klinger, would the election results affect Seoul-Washington ties in any way? What are the scenarios?
Well, they very well could. I think, those of us who are alliance watchers, are very positive on the steps that Korea and Japan have taken between themselves, as well as in conjunction with the United States. So in a way, we're drinking heavily in celebration, because we may be drinking heavily in commiseration after election results, because they could lead to a reduction in this momentum of increased alliance coordination and sharing. There is concern that in the National Assembly election, if the opposition gains a lot of seats, they may try to impede President Yoon's efforts to not only improve ties with the allies, but also to maintain a principled, pragmatic policy towards North Korea and China, as well as continuing his pledge to expand South Korea's role in the region. Also, there's concern that if President Trump is reelected, we don't know what his policies would be, but if the policies in his first term were very concerning to alliance managers. He had a more transactional view of alliances rather than based on shared values and principles and objectives. He threatened to reduce U.S. forces if we didn't make a big enough profit on our sons and daughters in uniform stationed overseas, and sort of et cetera. So I know in my discussions with South Korean and Japanese officials, there is concern that if there is a second term Trump administration, then it could go back to some of those issues that really strained the alliance in his first term.
All right, I see. Well, many scenarios, but I guess we'll just have to, wait and see how all of these things unfolds. All right, well, shifting gears a little bit here, Professor Sasada. The thaw in Seoul-Tokyo relations helped fuel momentum for three-way cooperation involving Washington. The leaders of the three countries held the landmark Camp David Trilateral Summit in August. What are the details of what was agreed and how significant was it?
The leaders have agreed on regularizing leaders' meeting and joint military exercises, and also agreed on cooperation for the problems on North Korea. In addition, the leaders agreed on to work together for the stability of East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and also cooperate for economic security. So trilateral cooperation now involves some new issues and perhaps regions. And it was traditionally focused on security issues in the Korean Peninsula or areas around that. But now it has expanded to a broader region and issue areas. First, the three countries aim to check China's advance in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific. United States needs its allied support in these areas because the U.S. has too many issues to cope with, such as the conflicts in Ukraine, Israel, and other areas. Second, economic security is an urgent issue for three countries. They need to secure the supply chains for significant important goods, such as semiconductors, oil and gases, and food, things of that nature. Reducing dependency on China requires three-way cooperation at the high level. So summit meeting at the Camp David was of historical importance.
Right, so the cooperation was indeed a very comprehensive one, I guess. Now, Mr. Klinger, as far as I know, among the agreements was the three countries launching a system to share real-time information on North Korean missile launches. And this began quite recently, just a few days after North Korea fired its solid-fuel Hwasong-18 ICBM. What data is going to be shared and how can three countries benefit from it?
Well, this is a development that really should have occurred many, many years ago. The information will enable all three countries to have a better and more quick assessment of when a North Korean missile has been launched and where its likely target is. If you think in terms of outfielders playing baseball, any one outfielder may think he knows where the ball is going to land and move to catch it or intercept a missile. But it's better, more accurate if you have the other two outfielders talking to you and sharing their perspectives because they have a different alignment of their sensors towards either catching the ball or intercepting the missile. So by now having all three of the outfielders or the three countries talking to each other very quickly and efficiently, it better protects all of our nations so we can better understand where the missile is going to land, and then we can more effectively use interceptors to take care of the missile before it hits any of our military targets or civilian targets. So it really was only able to occur because of the bold initiative by President Yoon and then the very bold response by Prime Minister Kishida. Technically, we could have done it many years ago, but it's just taken until now because of resolving or at least setting aside the difficult history issues.
Right, we indeed took a first step. Now, before we wrap up this segment, I'd like to ask our experts the importance of the three-way cooperation and how it is forecast to be in 2024. Now, Professor Sasada, how important would you say this trilateral cooperation is amid geopolitical risks facing the world? And what is your assessment of three-way ties cemented this year?
Yeah, my assessment of the three-way ties is quite positive, and I cannot stress enough how important that is. And I believe that leaders are making right decisions. The question is whether they can keep the momentum and deepen the cooperation even further. The United States will have the presidential election in 2024, and Japan is likely to have an election in the lower house next year. So there might be a change in leadership in those countries. Therefore, it is crucial for the leaders to set the foundation for trilateral cooperation as much as possible before any changes in the future. And that includes winning firm support on their policy from the general public.
All right, so the focus should be keeping the momentum between the three countries. Now, Mr. Klinger, I'd like to ask your opinion as well. How do you believe the three-way cooperation to be in 2024?
I agree with all of those excellent points. As the North Korean and Chinese threats have become more dangerous, at least on the positive side, not only our three nations, but also nations throughout the Indo-Pacific, and indeed NATO is seeing a greater involvement in the Indo-Pacific. So we're working much better together, although unfortunately in response to ever-growing threats. It's critically important for all of us to work together. And although we tend to focus mostly on the North Korean threat, this relationship is also expanding more into the Indo-Pacific. Last year, South Korea released its Indo-Pacific strategy, its first ever, and Japan released 3 national security documents, all of which show that the three nations are very aligned on our policies and our views on how to respond to these threats, not only in Northeast Asia on the peninsula, but also throughout the region. Now, South Korea tends to be a little more muted in its criticism of China than Japan and the United States do. But I think President Yoon is taking a lot of steps to expand South Korea's role as a global, GPS, global power state. And I think he's doing it perhaps quietly, but it's become very effective in expanding South Korea's role on the world stage.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Klinger, for your point of view. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Sazada and Mr. Klinger, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.